Good afternoon, guys. I got two people that ended up showing up today. Bit of a bummer. That's okay, though. All right, so before we get started with our course, I did want to let you guys know you'll be on mute by default. There is a Q&A button down at the bottom so that you guys can ask any questions that you have. We also have a chat option in case you guys are needing to make any commentary or if you guys wanted to provide an example of something. I also wanted to mention that we will be getting this recorded, and I'll be sending you guys the link after class is over, along with some extra bits and pieces here and there of just some tutorials. There's a guide that we'll be discussing during the course. And then I wanted to point out as well, if you have any audio or video issues during the course, please make sure to let me know as quickly as possible, primarily just because we want to make sure that everybody's getting the CE credit that they want. And this class wasn't initially advertised as a CE credit course, but we actually have recently gotten it applied as a CE class, which might have meant more people would have showed up, but that's okay. Anyway, we'll get the CE credit sent off, and hopefully you should see that applied before the end of the week, which is also the end of the month. I also wanted to point out those buttons again down at the bottom. There's a chat option for any commentary, Q&A for any questions you have, and then of course, raise hand if you would like to ask a question with your voice. And finally, if you're joining us on a mobile device, the buttons are still going to be down there. It's just a matter of tapping your screen. Once you click the screen, you should be able to see those same options. It'll have the raise hand, chat, and Q&A. All right. It doesn't look like our third registered person is going to be joining us. I think we might actually just go ahead and get started. And all right, perfect. Well, let's start off with our poll. This is going to be fairly simple. I will need both of you guys to participate in this for the CE credit. And then we should be able to get started with the course content. And I'm not sure who hasn't responded to the poll yet, but again, you need to respond to the poll in order to get the CE credit for the course. Okay. All right, we'll get that out of the way. So it looks like one of you is new, one of you is not. One of you does have permission for add edit, the other one is not sure. So the add edit permissions is actually fairly simple. Before we get started with the actual course, or the practical portion of the course, I did want to address where to actually get those permissions. So on the MLS portal, which you can get to by going to mlstechnology.com, there's going to be a button here called Forms and Contracts. When you click on that, there's going to be the membership forms over here to the right. And on there, there is going to be a section called MLS Tech with an option for Add Edit Authorization. So if you notice that you do not have add edit permissions, which is what we'll be showing in the matrix system in a moment here, if you notice you do not have add edit permissions already, you can always put in the application for that. Just as a heads up, this is actually going to require your broker's signature. So you can fill out the rest of the information if you would like, but your broker will have to sign this in order for us to be able to apply the permissions. All right, so let's head over to Matrix, and we're going to discuss at least just some basics of the class. So we want to ensure that everybody that has access to the add edit function in Matrix knows how to use the system and ensure that we're making listings that contain useful information for your fellow realtors to view, and then also to use to make sales. Now, as a lot of the information that we're going over today is primarily focused on the technical aspect of the data entry, we will not be lingering too long on the rules and regulations surrounding the entry. But to find out more about the statuses, any stipulations on listings, entering the listings, avoiding violations, I did want to at least get you over to where you can find the rules and regulations. So coincidentally, it's actually to the right of where we just found the forms and contracts. This is all going to be found under the governing documents. Governing documents has been separated out by our association and then the MLS. So the MLS rules are going to apply to a larger amount of people since we have more members than the association does, just by nature of being an MLS with multiple associations. So I would suggest getting in here to at least review the rules. That being said, it's a lot of legalese. I mean, it's 49 pages of content. So there's a lot to go through. We're going to be discussing a little bit about this stuff today, but there was one thing that I actually wanted to highlight before we move on. And that's actually the rule number 2.25. There we go. 2.25, errors or omissions on listings. Make this a little easier to read for you. MLS Tech shall not be liable for errors or omissions contained in the MLS. It is the responsibility of the listing participant to check his or her listing. If there is an error or omission on a listing, the following action should be taken. So central load means that we as the MLS are actually entering the listing directly for you. There's literally only one member that does that, so I'm assuming that's not going to be either of you guys in the future. What you guys are doing is going to be called broker load. So the responsibility is, if it's a broker load listing, the listing participant shall immediately correct his or her own listing errors. In the event that the listing participant is unable to make the necessary changes, he or she shall immediately notify the MLS in writing with an authorized signature. So the reason why we bring this up is just as a gentle reminder that whenever you guys are entering listings into the system, it's still your responsibility to make sure that all of the listing data is correct. So if you find yourself in a situation where the property is not mapped correctly, or if you end up having a situation where there's an incorrect price that needs to be adjusted after the fact, whatever the situation happens to be, it is still your responsibility to try and make sure that that's done. So it's fairly simple. I mean, by the time you enter the listing, you should know whether or not there's any kinds of problems with it, but that's typically going to be the case. Oh, welcome, Jasmine. All right, so that's it for our rules. Just so that you guys are aware, we do actually have a full-on rules and regulations class that goes over some of the minutia that we're going to be discussing. Today's class is actually not going to be focused on any of the technical aspects of the statuses or some of the rules regarding when to enter listings into the system. We do cover that in our rules and regulations class though, so I would suggest if you guys haven't taken that to give it a try, because we try to target a little bit more of the important things that a lot of people are either messing up or kind of need a little reminder of. So let's get started with the very first step of the add edit process. And coincidentally, this is actually not going to be occurring in Matrix. So when we first need to actually get a listing put into the system, we need to gather all of the information to put that into our system. The good news is we actually have all of that codified and put into a PDF. This is actually going to be back under the first place that we went earlier, under forms and contracts. When you get into forms and contracts, this is going to be found under the MLS specific forms, and then under matrix data forms. Now we're going to be coming back here later to find the MLS change form and then also a firm exclusive form, but the matrix data forms is where we can find the initial batch of information that we're going to have to put in on our listings. It's broken down into the 4 different property subtypes, or property types, excuse me, property types that we have. We've got one for residential, one for vacant land, one for residential leasing, and then one for commercial sales. So just to clarify, we have 2 categories for residential properties. One is sales, one is leasing. We have 1 category for vacant land sales and 1 category for commercial sales. We have noticed a few people at least that have been putting in commercial lease properties, which we don't actually accept in our system. We literally just don't have the infrastructure for it, nor the rules and regulations regarding those. But we do actually allow for residential properties to put in as a leased property. Just an important note, that means that it has to be a residential property. We have had some commercial properties that are for lease that have been put into the leasing, and that's not allowed. You would think that, you know, if you came across a thing that was asking for a bedroom count and it happened to be required, that you would know better, but c'est la vie. So what we're going to do is I'm actually going to jump into the residential property data forms. We're going to be focusing in on the residential side of things, primarily because anything that we're learning on the residential forms is going to be applicable to the other forms, as well as this being, in my opinion, the more complicated of all of the options. There's more fields to fill out, there's more details that people want about residential properties than any of the other options. And then of course, the only difference between the sales and the leasing is going to be a couple extra terms about the way that the property is listed, so on and so forth. But we're going to start off with the residential sales as our kind of starting point. And on this property data form, we actually see that there's a bunch of little asterisks all over the form indicating which items are actually required in order for the listing to be put into the system. So whether it's coming soon, the listing agent, the office name, some of the basics about obviously the property itself. But you'll notice that there's also going to be some things that have two asterisks. So rather than just indicating that this is a required field, these double asterisks are actually indicating that if you want to tell us about the kitchen, so you know whether it has a breakfast nook or a country style kitchen or eat-in or island, whatever, you're going to have to cite where that particular room is located in the house, on what floor. So if you do go through this and you wanted to cite where the master bedroom was, you have to tell what floor it was on. Where the master bathroom is, you're going to have to tell what floor it's on. So some of the other options on here are going to be found under the HOA, where the HOA being mandatory is actually required, and the rest of these fields are actually not required unless you've cited that the HOA is mandatory. We also wanted to point out something else on here. There is a home square footage option in the system, and it used to be that we actually had an option for owner. So you could actually use the source of the home's square footage as just an owner that had been providing us with the information. We no longer allow that to happen, and primarily what it boils down to is just that the square footage has to come from a valid source, and we have to have documentation of that. Unfortunately, we ended up in a situation a few years ago where there was an owner-cited square footage. The property was sold. The buyer ended up getting an appraisal done of the property and found that the square footage was off by at least a few hundred feet. So the price of the property should have been lower, valued less, blah, blah, blah. So really what we ended up deciding after the dust settled from the lawsuit was that we were going to end up having only 3 sources available. And you have to have one of those, or you're just not going to be reporting the square footage at all, which means that you're going to have to put 0 for the square footage and choose the option not reporting. So if you have the paperwork for the appraisal, if you have the paperwork for the building permit, or if the courthouse records, the tax records, whatever, has the correct square footage, you can also pull from that. Thankfully, with the courthouse side of things, you don't have to have a paper that says that. If it's the same square footage as what shows up in Realist, that's enough. I also wanted to point out down here at the very bottom, we actually have spaces for the public remarks, realtor remarks, and directions. The only one that's actually required out of these is the directions. Now, there is one exception to this. If you guys do end up putting in a uh, statistical purposes listing, which again has to have been closed already. You can't put in a statistical purposes listing as active or pending. It has to have already closed. But that's the only time you actually have to put something in the public remarks, and that's entered for statistical purposes. Easy peasy. That's actually covered in our rules and regulations under the closed status section. So right up there, I think on like page 3 or 4. Anyway, so that's it for our paperwork. Just again, this is going to be giving you all of the fields that you actually have to fill out in order for your listing to be valid in the system. So using this as a guideline is a great idea. Now, it used to be that this was actually something that was required for every single listing, and we've moved away from that so that there is actually a couple different ways that people have done this. I think there's at least 3 offices that I know of that have turned this into a digital option. So something that, it just asks the agent for each and every piece of information. So you don't have to use this sheet of paper or even just go into transaction desk and fill this out all digitally. So either way, this is available as a guideline. Once you have that information, I'm actually going to head back into Matrix now, and we're going to start start filling out the data. So I'm going to click on this Add New option. Just as a heads up, if you do not have Add Edit permission, clicking on that Add New option is going to be your first clue as to whether or not you have access. If it tells you that you can't do it, you just simply don't have the Add Edit permissions. Oh, and I'm sorry, Chris, I just noticed your question. The seller does not have to sign that. As far as I'm aware, it's not necessarily a requirement, but it is in my opinion at least, a good idea to have them go through that just to make sure that the listing agent didn't, put in bad information effectively. I do know that there are some agents that actually give them all the way up to page 6 and just ask them to fill that out. And then of course, public remarks, the directions, all that, the rest of the stuff they fill out themselves. So kind of up to you guys how you want to do that. I think it would be nice to have the seller's name on there so that if there is any bad information that I was given by the seller, they've already signed off on it. Anyway, let's head back to Matrix. We've got our Add New Listing. And just like we saw with our property data forms, it's going to be delineated by residential, vacant land, leasing, and commercial. Residential, commercial, vacant land, leasing. So I'm going to start off with the residential. And this is going to bring me to a screen where I can either fill a listing's data from a previous listing. So this would actually just go through and grab all the fields that it can that are going to be relevant for selling the property. And then it's going to end up allowing you to put in the price, the dates involved, what kind of contract you have, whether there's still a warranty in effect, et cetera. So it's going to leave some blanks on there, but it's all going to be relevant towards this sale right now, rather than grabbing data from a couple of years ago and somebody else's contract, et cetera. Now, when you land on this screen, if you already have that MLS number, you can just dump it into this spot here and then do fill from. If you do not have the MLS number in hand, but you know that this property was listed previously, you can actually search for it using this field here. So we've got a whole bunch of different options to narrow down our search. My suggestion always boils down to this. Just put in the listing right here. Why is it not auto-filling? Oh, I guess that's, okay. We can put that in there and then just do the search. Hey, okay. By the way, if you guys ever have somebody tell you to use Chrome instead of anything else, it's because of this. 1373, you see how it's trying to offer me a drop down here to try and fill this out. If this was something that I had filled before, side, there we go. Now it'll actually give me the pop-up. I had to tab in order to show that. On Chrome, it doesn't do that. It's not gonna, anyway. I'm gonna run my search. Let's do within a quarter mile, make sure I can actually find this. Oh, and I forgot to, anyway. You can run your search for it. There's an address field here. There's an address field here. There's a couple different ways to try and track it down. Just as a heads up, the mistake I just made is that I left this active. So if I actually wanted to try and find any of the previous listings for this property, I can just do Riverside. There we go. Search. Brings up all the previous listings. I can grab the most recent one, hit fill, and I'm good to go. And again, that's going to fill out a lot of the details of the property for me by default. If there is not a listing in the system previously, then you're going to have to put in everything manually. If there is a tax record for the property, you can also import from that. I would suggest some hesitance to this just because of the fact that there is going to be some trouble trying to track it down. My suggestion would be to do the search just by picking the county, putting in the street number, so just the house number at the beginning of the address, and just the street name. So I'll do the same thing that we did just then, 1373, Riverside, and search. Lo and behold, it actually found it on the first try. So we can click fill. Again, it's going to grab as much information as it can from the public records. If it doesn't find everything, it's not going to end up giving you a very complete sheet. So you'll still end up having to fill in a lot of blanks. So listing is the priority. If you can find a previous listing, if not, use that tax record. If you can't find even a tax record for it, or if it's a brand new parcel, brand new subdivision, whatever the case may be, you'll end up having to go back to this, start with a blank listing. Now, when you start with the listing, either with the information filled out, or in my case, with the blank listing, it's going to bring you to a page that has a bunch of tabs up here at the top. This is what's referred to as the wizard. So it's going to step us through this one step at a time to make sure that we've got all the information that's required and needed, and then we can submit our listing. It starts us off on this tab that says status. And you'll notice, because this is a relatively short tab and the rest of these are going to kind of push things down on the page, when we're on the status page, we get to see those buttons at the bottom of the screen. There's a save as incomplete option. Save as incomplete will take all of the information that you have entered so far, save it as an incomplete listing. So it has an MLS number. You can come back and correct anything or fix anything before you submit it. There's also a validate option. The validate option is going to verify whether or not there's anything that's either incorrect or missing. One of the handy features with this validate option is that if you've started filling information out, you can hit validate to make sure that everything is copacetic first. It's also going to end up putting little highlights up here at the top, these little red dots, indicating that there's something missing from each and every one of these tabs. As you finish something on a tab, so let's just do this as an example. There we go. So I got something in there. If I hit validate, it's actually going to clear that flag from that tab. And I also see now that I've got my yellow indicating that it's required, and there's no errors or anything telling me that I've got something wrong in there or that it is empty. So that validate option is kind of effectively giving us a to-do list. There's also an option here to cancel input. So if you guys figure out that it kind of doesn't end up wanting to work with me, you can just hit cancel input. Or if you guys need to start up after you have more information, whatever the case may be, you can use that. And then finally, the last option is going to be submit listing. This is when we're completely done. There's no red dots anywhere. There's nothing missing. There's no errors. Hit submit listing and it'll be a live listing in our system. Now I say live instead of active because back up here to the top where we've got our status, we do get to choose between two different statuses for our listings to be entered in. The coming soon option is actually going to allow us to have a listing that's going to be advertised only to other MLS members within Matrix. There's no advertising. You can't take offers on it. You can't do showings on it. Coming soon is relatively restrictive. And for those of you guys who have taken a look at the rules and regulations on it, it's pretty strict. So what it boils down to, and it actually gives a little bit of a synopsis right here, boils down to I have a listing. It's not going to be ready immediately, but I at least want to let other realtors know that this property is going to be available soon. So what you can do is actually put it in as a coming soon listing, and that'll actually show only other realtors that that listing is going to be available. Another thing that has to be put on the coming soon is a showing start date. I'll show you guys that on the property info screen where our listing data is going to be the listing date, expiration date, all that kind of stuff. There is going to be an extra field that you have to fill out on coming soon called the showing start date. The showing start date has to be within 10 days, not 10 business days, 10 calendar days from the list date. So if you have a listing that goes in on the 1st, it'll have to be available and active in the system by the 10th. Now, if you end up putting it in on the 1st and you say that you only need 5 days for coming soon, you can move that day out. So for instance, if on the 5th day your client still hasn't cleaned up the place or they're still waiting on the paint job to be finished, whatever, they will end up having the option to move it forward. So we can wait till day 7, day 9, day 10. But after that, if the room is, or if the property is still not ready, it'll go active automatically and you'll have to put it into a withdrawn status. Now, let's say we do end up having a client that cleans up early. So we got all of their paperwork put in, they signed their coming soon seller authorization form. They've set the date out for 10 days out, and then 7 days in, they realize, oh, you know what? Actually, it's a weekend. We're already done. We're already cleaned up. We should probably try and take advantage of this weekend time. If you set the coming soon showing start date sometime in the future, it cannot be moved back. So what that means is that if you set a date, know that you cannot move it any sooner. We have had a lot of phone calls about this. And just to clarify, this isn't something that we decided on. This was actually a rule that was pretty much copy pasted from the NAR Clear Cooperation 8.0 Act that came out in 2020. So we're just working with their recommendations, just so that you guys at least get some context for why it is that way. We have it set up that way because if an agent comes in, sees that there's a listing that's coming soon, they've got a showing start date in the future, and they start working with a client to maybe schedule a showing after it goes active. If it goes active earlier, and especially with the market being what it is now, it ends up going pending. By the time that agent ends up getting to, set up a showing for the property, it could have already sold. So it's extremely counterproductive to the cooperation and compensation part of the MLS. We want to make sure that everybody has the same fair access to a listing. So during that coming soon phase, no showings, no offers, no advertising. Very simple. So if we set this to just simply be active, we'll have one less field to fill out. Again, we don't have to put in the showing start date for an active listing because it's going to be showing start date now. As soon as I hit submit listing, if it's active, it can be shown, it can take offers, etc. So I'm going to leave mine on active for now. Let's move on to the property info screen. Now on property info, I have a bunch of little red triangles indicating that I'm missing things. If I had not hit validate, those would not be indicating that. In fact, we'd actually end up just seeing this little question mark here. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go up here, we'll get in some basic information, put in my street type, it's avenue, we've got a township, it has to be 2 characters or 2 numbers and then the direction. There we go. And then section is only 2 characters. But there's a couple things that I've skipped over here, the street name and the subdivision. Now, with something like the county or even the city, we should have a relatively short list of all the things that might need to be added on there. But with subdivisions and street names, there is a plethora of different names out there. So we've actually decided to codify that list, in part because we wanted to prevent people from doing unethical things with the data, but also because kind of got tired of seeing spelling mistakes on street names. So on the street name field, we do have autofill street name. You click on that, you type in your street name, run search, and you'll be able to fill from that. So now I've got Main Street on there, Main Avenue in this case. And then for my subdivision, we've got effectively a similar option to that, but instead of it just being any name whatsoever, we do actually want to try and narrow it down by county and then subdivision. Now, subdivisions are fairly simple. If you end up putting in a portion of the name, it'll present you with a nice short list so that you can just grab whichever one you need, run your search, and you only get one response. If you do end up in a situation where the property does not have a subdivision, this is a lot more likely with rural properties or vacant land properties as well. If you have a required field like subdivision and you do not have a subdivision to put in there, you can actually just put in the county's name. So Tulsa CO in this case, is going to be Tulsa County Unplatted. Now, one caveat with doing the unplatted is that it allows you to put in the name, it'll autofill the county for you, but the city, the school district, the township range, and section will not automatically fill in for you. If I were to just jump in here and do Turtle Creek, there we go, run search, it's actually going to find the subdivision name, county, city, school district, township range, and section. So if I needed to add that in there, I hit fill, and it replaces any of the details that I had in there that were false and puts in all new information for me. So I don't have to go find the township range and section, etc. The year built is also a field that we require. This one does still have the option to do an owner site. So if you end up having a situation where you can't find what the appraiser said the year was that it was built, you can't find the builder permit, can't find it on the county records, you can actually ask the owner to provide you with that number so that way we can actually cite that on our listing. Schools also will occasionally have, actually, you know what, let me see if I can find one because there's a good example. Here we go. Schools do have some old references in the system. This is primarily because we actually have old listings in the system that we're citing Oak Park as a school. So we need to leave that historical data in our system for comps and for, you know, just records. But some of those are going to actually have closed. So we have those marked in our system. If we see that someone has actually used a closed school on a listing, we'll get in contact with you to let you know, because that's not allowed. I know some people kind of get bent out of shape about this, and I know that this can be frustrating. So it's not something that we're unaware of, but we do want to try and make sure that if a buyer is going to be moving into a home and they have children, they know where their kids are going to be going. So for instance, if Oak Park wasn't actually closed, there's actually still a school building, there's still functioning, there's still students going to that school, but the school is not going to be open next school year, we will mark it as closed in our system so that you don't falsely advertise that that's where they're going to be going. They'll need to know what the school is if they actually apply for that school and start, or apply to go to school in that area. They'll need to know which one they're actually going to be going to. I think Bartlesville is one of the few that actually still has a bunch of closed schools. Is it Creek, I think, as well? Anyway, we'll just do that. Perfect. So I got all that put in. If I hit validate again, you see all these little red triangles. Click on validate, and it's going to disappear those for me because it's already got the information in there. It matches what I was supposed to match. So let's do an example here of the legal description. So I'm going to just put in some information. So we'll do township range and section. Oops, go. There we go. So I've got some information in here for the legal description, and that might literally be all that they provided to me. But if you find yourself in a situation where you do not have a more fleshed out legal description, and you see the little triangle here, what this is indicating is that it actually has to have at least 15 characters as a minimum. Now, our rules and regulations stipulate that you can either cite the subdivision that this property is physically located in, or you can cite the county in there. So in this case, I would just put in Tulsa County, and I've already got my township range and section in there, which is also required for a legal description. So now that I've got that filled out, I can see that that little message has gone away. So even if you guys do find yourself in a situation where you don't know what something's referring to, like maybe you're unfamiliar with what homestead is referring to specifically, You can click on either the arrow or you can click on the little question mark, and that'll indicate to you what it's asking for, and also more often than not, what format they would like that to be put in. So if I put in my property subtype, I can validate, clears that little triangle. List price, say that I put in too little. It's going to tell me that that's not allowed. 1,000, there we go. If I put in my list date too far back, I'll hit validate, and look at that, still giving me an error, and it's telling me current date or within the last 7 days if incomplete. So I'm going to save this again, do today, do tomorrow for the expiration. Say homestead, yes. Multiple parcels, no. And I should mention on multiple parcels, there's 2 different ways for us to enter what are now called bulk listings in the system. So if you do have a seller that's trying to get rid of multiple parcels of property, you can enter each of those parcels separately and then mention in the public remarks that they can be split. Or you can actually enter one listing for all of the parcels and then just mention whether or not, again, they can be split. I would typically recommend as well that you guys include the tax parcel numbers on the public remarks, or just mention any of the other listings that are going to be related to that parcel in the comments, or in the public remarks, excuse me. So in my case, I'm going to just say no. We've got our home square footage, and I mentioned before that we only allow this from a couple of different sources. Again, appraiser, building permit, or courthouse records. And again, if you use the appraiser or the building permit option, someone has a question about that square footage, you better be ready to show that paperwork. And just as a reminder, one more time, if you do not have one of those 3 sources that's accurate to your property, so if the courthouse records are incorrect because they've expanded the property, if the building permit is no longer accurate, or if they did not do an appraisal, you're going to have to put in 0 for the square footage and not reporting square footage. Now, the good news is that you guys don't have to not show anything for the property. There is a house size option up here at the top. So for instance, if I wanted to at least let people know what an estimate of the size of the property is, I can put it up there. Because this is being presented as a range and pretty explicitly mentioned as an estimate for the property, you don't have to worry about this being false advertising, unless it's over or under the 1250 or 1500 or whatever the case may be. Number of stories is actually kind of a sore spot for a certain ex-employee. The number of stories is actually meant to indicate how many stories the house has, but the specifications of how that's supposed to be referenced is kind of weird. Technically speaking, as far as how we would like to see it, 2 stories is actually indicating that you have the same square footage on one floor as well as the floor above it. So if I had if this property was 2,000 square feet and I had 1,000 on the first floor and 1,000 on the second floor, perfect. That's a flat 2 stories. If the first floor has 1,000 square feet and the second floor has 750, that would be 1.75. Now, I don't think that it's necessary to try and get into the exact specifications of like what the ratio is between the first and second floor, but you guys can always just put in 1.5 to indicate that the second floor is available. It's just not a full second floor. I'm going to put in 0 for fireplace. I'm going to put in 1 for garage capacity. And the lot size is another one that we end up having questions on. Lot size is actually referring only to the square footage of the property. This is a little bit bizarre how we have this set up, but the reason we have this set up this way is because we don't want people to just say that there's a full digit number of acres for the property. If you do want to cite the number of acres and you do not have the square footage because the parcel is large and you only ever see it referenced with the acres, there is a pretty simple formula that you guys can use. It's under the question mark for lot size square feet. It'll have the acres. Excuse me, it'll have the acres broken down so you guys can actually see what the actual square footage is. All right, so I'm gonna say, okay. And we've got a tax amount. Grab that from most recent tax year if you can. Now let's talk about the mapping. Oh, actually, let me validate so we don't see any. Okay, perfect. So the only thing we have left on this page is the mapping. Now, the mapping is one of the things that I personally have a pet peeve about, primarily because we do occasionally see listings that are supposedly in Oklahoma, but are actually mapped elsewhere. Let's see. I think I might actually have a example. Hey, I do. Excellent. All right. And it's a frequent offender of this as well. But uh, here's an example. So we actually have an automated search that checks for this stuff, but we got a listing here. This is in Panama, Oklahoma. If I go to the view map, it is currently mapped near Louisville in Kentucky. So I'm fairly certain that they probably don't want to just be outside of Lexington. So they might need to adjust that later. Just keep an eye on what your listing got mapped to. So there's a button right here that says get lat long from address. When you click on this, it's going to automatically try and map it based on the address that you provided. Now, it's important to recognize that this does not mean that it's going to map it to the correct location. And in fact, we've actually had a lot of people complaining recently that it's not even just mapping properties out of state. It could just be mapping a property 5 miles away. So always try to make sure that you have your address as accurate as you possibly can. I think a lot of the people that have been complaining about that recently have just been skipping putting in the street type. That's my suspicion. I don't think that that's 100% true, but there are a lot of people that are like, oh, it's not mapped correctly. And I get in here and I find their house number is in there, their street name is in there. They don't put in a street direction, a post direction, or the street type. And lo and behold, it doesn't map correctly. What a surprise. So if you do want to verify that it is correctly mapped, I always recommend going to this set lat long manually. This is going to give you a preview of where it's actually going to be. And it's also going to allow you to move it to the proper location. So for instance, if this was, just a couple streets away from where it was actually supposed to be, you can move that down to the right location, make sure that the pin is on exactly the right spot, and you'll be good to go. You do also have an option to do a search up at the top here. So for instance, if you find yourself in a situation where it's not mapping correctly, you can try again here. Just make sure that you're putting in the full address, hit locate. It'll find roughly where it is, and then you can just do place new pin, drop it right where it needs to go. So I've got that mapped. I'm all set with where it's physically located. And if you notice, I no longer have a red dot up here at the top of the screen. Now, the rooms is the only other section that we're going to linger on before we move on to actually saving this and adding photos, changing its status, et cetera, et cetera. So I wanted to point out on the rooms section, the bedroom count is required, the full bath, half bath is required, living area, whether or not there's a storm shelter, does not require mention of the basement. Obviously, welcome to Oklahoma, not all basements exist. We've also got a room description section, which matches what we saw earlier on this rooms page. So if you guys remember, we mentioned that this is going to be a contextual requirement. So if I do end up wanting to cite that there is a master bedroom, I'm going to have to mention whether or not it has any of these. If it doesn't, no worries. I can hit validate, and this time it's actually going to indicate I am required to cite where it's located in the property, whether it's first floor, second, third, or basement. It'd be really nice if we had some luxury properties with 4 floors, right? Anyway, if you do end up citing something, again, you got to just put that in there. When you hit validate, it'll clear those markers for you. There is no requirement on putting in public remarks or realtor remarks, but just remember that there are a certain number of characters and you have to put in directions to the property. This is just a requirement. Our rules and regulations actually are pretty explicit in this. If you're going to cite, or if you're going to put in directions to the property, it can't just say something like use GPS. It can't just be the address again. It has to be directions to the property from some specified location. I know I kind of make a joke of this, but in earnest, you could actually do this. If you guys wanted to just use wherever the nearest Dollar General was, that could be a great way to just be like, it's the Dollar General in Eufaula. You just got to go down the road 2 blocks and turn left at the whatever road name it is. But don't use GPS. Don't do the, man, what was the other one that I saw recently? Somebody had put in GPS to, and then cited a neighbor's house and then said, it's a block away from that. And I hate to say this, but not everybody in our membership actually has a smartphone. So as bizarre as it seems that we would need to make sure that the directions are always really explicit, you can't assume that everybody has GPS, can't assume that everybody has a smartphone. And also you can't expect everybody to have 100% internet connection all the time. So if they do end up having their internet fail, but they've got that sheet of paper in their hand, they'll still be able to track down the property. I do have one member that calls in very frequently because he's trying to find properties that the agent has either not mapped correctly or not provided adequate directions. It's just a little awkward to have to be the on-call Garmin for somebody just because agents are not putting in good details. All right. That's it for the data entry. I'm going to go ahead and hit save as incomplete. Whether you guys save it as incomplete or whether you submit the listing, you're going to be presented with the exact same screen. It's going to tell you that they've got an MLS number. It's going to tell you what the status was, whether it was coming soon or active or incomplete in this case. And then it's going to allow you to add in any documents, manage the showing time, showing restrictions, appointment availability, etc. Or you can order photos from Home Visit, which is a feature of CoreLogic. And then there's also an option down here at the bottom to add or edit photos. Now, adding and editing photos is very simple. Whenever you guys are adding the photos to the listing, there's going to be a browse button here. You find the property's photos. You can actually select multiple at once if you guys want to upload all of them at the same time. Not suggested if you guys have large photos. You guys are uploading really high resolution photos. It might be wise not to include all of them at once, just do them in small batches. But since I've got mostly small photos, I don't have to worry about that. Once it's finished with the upload process, we can actually add in descriptions, but just a heads up, these only appear in Matrix. They don't syndicate out to anywhere. And I mean that literally. Like we even have a mobile app called MLS Touch. They don't even show the captions on our own app. They are exclusively within Matrix. So you guys can add extra information in there if you would like, but just remember it's only going to be shown to other agents, not even on one home. We also have the option to move these around. So if I ended up needing to maybe adjust which one this is located in, this is a kind of a usability thing for me, but there is only one area that you guys can actually move the listing or move the photos with, and that's that guy right there. It has to be on this title bar. If you're not moving it on the title bar, you're going to end up getting some weird artifacts of how this actually works. So if I try and just click here, you notice how it kind of seems like it's pulling test around. It's not even in the right location. The cursor's elsewhere. But if I grab the actual header up at the top where it says slot whatever, I can move this over and drop it into the right position. So if I need that to be my primary, I can do that. I need to switch this location, I can do that. And if I needed to get rid of anything, check the checkbox, delete checked. Easy peasy. Once you're done with this, certify and save. And I wanted to point something out here. After I've saved my photos, my listing is still incomplete. I have not submitted this listing. It is not live. It's not active, coming soon, whatever. This is still an incomplete listing. So I've just added all my photos in advance of it actually being submitted. Now, there's also a section here for manage documents via transaction desk that I wanted to mention. Whenever you guys are adding listings into the system, you are required to put in the property condition disclosures unless you have an exemption or a disclaimer or the very, very few exceptions to that rule. Like 90% of the listings in the system have to have a property condition disclosure. So since that's required, and since there is actually a time frame requirement, it has to be uploaded within 1 business day. You can click on that manage documents via transaction desk. You can add it to an existing transaction, but even if you don't care about transaction desk at all, you can just do create new transaction. It automatically imports the number or the address, automatically imports the listing number. I'm going to add myself as the listing agent, create, and that's it. You don't have to start using transaction desk. You're not required to change which system you're using to do anything. It's literally just a matter of using this as a storage space. So think of this like Dropbox or Google Drive, where you're actually just uploading some basic information and that's it, nothing else required. So once you have your property condition disclosure uploaded, your incomplete listing will actually now start to show that there are documents attached to it underneath the photo. And then once you make it active, of course, that'll be available to any of the realtors. All right. Now, everything I've been doing has kind of been all in line with the process. Let's talk quickly about how to actually get back into things and what to do after the listing has gone live and how to make that active, pending, closed, expired, whatever. So when we get back to the add edit page, if I need to jump back into that specific listing I just was working on, there is a quick modify dropdown here that allows me to see all of my incomplete listings, all my active listings, pending listings, and the coming soon listings as well. You will not see any listings that have expired, been withdrawn, are closed, released. None of those will appear on this quick modify list. I'll show you guys how to find the rest of those in a minute. So I'm going to jump back into my 123 Main Street, or Main Avenue. And this brings me back to a similar page to what we saw before, where there's a residential button. We can add in any virtual tours, delete this entire listing, which is what I'm going to do after we're done with this today. Manage the photos, which is, again, that same option that we just viewed. Manage documents, again, same thing we just discussed, and manage showing time. Now, if we have a listing that's already active and we need to change the status of that listing, we can go to that quick modify dropdown, and it's going to present us with, again, a place for us to change what the expiration date is. If I needed to move this into the future sometime, there we go. We also can change what the list price was, or maybe we finally got an appraisal done, so I can go back and actually add in my square footage and put in appraisal. So if any of those changes are needed, you just click on whatever the property type was. So if it's residential, you click on residential, vacant, click on vacant, so on. This gives you all the details for the property. This is also a great place for you guys to come if you need to add in any details about that property. So like just finished a new paint job or renovated the kitchen, blah, 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 whatever options you need to add in there to try and promote the property. So I'm going to hit cancel input to get out of that listing. And just as a heads up for you guys, if you do end up calling with questions about a specific listing and need us to make a change for you, whether it's MLS change form that you've submitted, or whether it's just a call to us and there's some problem with your listing, in order for us to be able to access that listing, you're going to need to hit this cancel option. So whether you guys are in this particular portion where you guys can make changes yourself, hit cancel, or submit it if that's the need, and then make sure to hit cancel again. Every once in a while, we get phone calls from people where they're still in the listing and then we can't make the change to it. So we'll get in contact with you, make sure you're done with whatever changes you need to make, and then we'll get the listing updated. But if you need to make a change to the status for the listing, that's going to be underneath where we had the details for the property. We can change it to active with contingent, which means that there's maybe a buyer that's still waiting on their property to sell, and you still want to make sure that there's backup offers. You can also change it to pending. Both of these are going to require the same information. We need a pending date. We need an anticipated closing date. Now, this is something that you guys may have noticed in the past. We actually have a pop-up that came up for a while. There was a lot of listings that were actually exceeding their anticipated closing date. We will notify you the day that this listing actually is beyond when it was supposed to have closed, in order to let you know that, hey, you may have a listing that needs to be updated. We will send an email. We will start giving you a notice and matrix. And after 30 days, then you'll end up getting a fine. So I did want to let you guys know, even though we do have fines related to the anticipated closing date, part of the reason why we're comfortable fining people for that is because we've typically given people a full month, if not more, to actually get that piece of information updated. Anyway, we also have a section down here at the bottom for us to find a selling associate. It's a simple search function. You can put in first, last, office ID, all sorts of different information. Let's say that you do end up having an interaction either with an agent that's outside of our system, or you have a sales fee agreement with some for sale by owner, and you represented the buying side. You'll have to put that listing in with non-MLS. So again, if they're not a member of our MLS, you won't be able to find them under Find a Selling Agent. So you'll just have to put in non-MLS. So pretty easy. I'm actually going to submit this one. Tomorrow, yesterday is the pending date. There we go. So my listing is now officially in pending. If I go back to continue editing, it's going to just provide me with the immediate previous spot. But if I need to actually change this to closed, so later on down the line, I've got this listing finally closed. I'm going to go back to the add edit, go back to quick modify, down to pending, and I can now change this to sold. It's important to note as well, if you do need to update the anticipated closing date, I'm actually going to go back to change to pending, even though it's already in pending, to change that anticipated closing date. So we just switch that over into the future, submit listing, and I'm good to go. If I needed to make this closed, it's going to require just a little bit more information. It's actually going to ask us for close price, close date, what the financing was that was used, what the seller paid in closing costs, add that commentary. If there is actually a yes here, it'll actually tell you that you have to put that in there. But it'll also import over whoever the selling associate was whenever you made it pending, so you don't have to fill that information out. Now, that being said, we also wanted to point out that there is an option here to change a listing to released. A lot of people use this kind of flippantly, not realizing that this is actually something that's going to go permanently on this particular property. We can go back and find this information. We've had people that have released listings to do some unethical stuff. Try not to ever change this to a status that's not accurate, most especially changing things to released. If we end up having a property that was set to released and we get any question whatsoever about whether or not it was actually supposed to have been released, we will be getting in contact with the office and we will be asking for the release paperwork. If that's not accurate, it's going to go back in the system. We're going to make sure that everything is put back together, set the days on market back to what it's supposed to be, et cetera, et cetera. All right. Last thing that I wanted to mention before we actually leave is if you do end up having a situation where the system is not allowing you to make an edit, and especially if it's not allowing you to make an edit that's actually valid, under the forms and contracts section, again, under MLS specific forms, there is an MLS change form over here. You need to fill this information out and then have either your broker or an authorized signer for your office who should know who they are. If you don't, again, default back to your broker. They have to sign this in order for us to make the change. This is not something that we can accept the listing agent as the person that submits it. All right, but that's it for today's class. Again, I'm going to be getting a recording out to you guys. It's also going to include a bunch of tutorials about it. And there's also going to be a little handout that will provide you guys. I put this handout together as a way to try and make sure that, if you're very new or if you're a very seasoned agent, you're still going to be able to get something out of it. It is a digital document. You can print it off if you would like, but there are some links that are contained within the PDF. Beyond that, if I could get everybody to hit that raise hand button just to let me know that you're still here, then we'll go ahead and close up the call. Oh, I will stick around for some questions if anybody has any, but yeah, just hit the raise hand button down at the bottom. Let me know that you're actually here and paying attention. If you do not, I will not be able to give you credit. Oh, that's everybody. All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us today. Again, if you have any questions, you can let me know right now. Otherwise, give us a call over the service desk. We're open Monday through Friday, 8 to 5:30. So if you guys have a problem, if you're running into some issue, or if you guys just need some clarification on something, just give us a call. All right, we're gonna go ahead and close up shop. And thank you guys so much for joining us today. If you have any issues, we'll be here for you.